This is the next in the Patriot Minute series. I'm Grandpa Rick, the hero who inspired the American Revolution. Quote, "We live in an age that maketh truth pass for treason. My trial and condemnation sufficiently evidence this," unquote. Algernon Sydney. At dawn, King Charles II's soldiers forced their way into Algernon Sydney's home in Northumberland, England, charging Algernon with treason against the crown. They tore through personal possessions, searching for anything they could use against him. And while there were no legitimate witnesses against Sydney, that would never stop a tyrant, for evidence can always be found. June 25th, 1683, Algernon was arrested by agents of King Charles. He was accused of conspiring to overthrow the king, and since the king's prosecutors could find no credible witnesses, they confiscated Sydney's own personal writings, which had not been published, actually. They were personal, proclaiming, "Scribere est agere," meaning to write is to act. In essence, Sydney would be punished for thought crimes. So Algernon Sydney was quickly convicted for his beliefs, his thoughts, for his love of liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. Then he was marched to the gallows. His final words, quote, "Grant that I may die glorifying thee, O Father," unquote. The great advocate for Republican liberty, Algernon Sydney, died alone. His crime, in essence, was his condemnation of the divine right of kings, or the elite of his day. And though 400 years have passed since his trial and execution, I am certain Algernon Sydney would understand our day. The attacks on free speech today that we see, conveniently and deceptively are labeled hate speech, of course, are rushing at us from the left and are designed to wear us down in order to control us. In essence, Algernon was brought to account for his lack of woke sensitivity towards the rulers of his day, and his punishment was sure and swift. In fact, as we look at this great man, America's founding fathers knew Algernon Sydney. They knew his writings that had survived. Yes, indeed, Sydney's story teaches us much, for his spirit stood shoulder to shoulder with both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams as they penned the Declaration of Independence. He was a man who understood the unique concepts of personal liberty and opportunity for all, and not just the privileged. He called out to the oligarchy of his day, even the king himself and his hangers-on, exposing their duplicity, corruption, and vice. Algernon Sydney was born in 1623 in England to an aristocratic family. From an early age, however, the inquisitive boy was influenced by the works of philosophers like John Locke and Hugo Grotius. Sydney believed passionately that individuals are blessed by God, even above monarchs or governments, with personal individual gifts of freedom of thought, speech, worship, assembly, property, and movement. He believed that bureaucrats, and he calls them magistrates in his writings, exist solely to bless and help individual citizens to prosper and be free, and certainly not to oppress the common man or woman, or for the elite's personal enrichment or political advancement. So, as you can imagine, Algernon Sydney's words cut deep, and they enraged the corrupt oligarchy, the leaders of his time. On his final day on earth, however, he ignored these crooked men of privilege, and he offered his gratitude to God alone. Quote, "Grant that I may die glorifying thee for all thy mercies, and for that old cause of individual freedom in which I was from my youth engaged, and for which thou hast often and wonderfully declared thyself to me." We know from his writings exactly where he would stand today, squarely with the so-called salt of the earth, Americans who do the hard, dirty, necessary jobs, who go to church and to try to raise their children believing in God and liberty and loving our divinely inspired nation. Algernon Sydney inherited from his father his love of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He loved truth and hated hypocrisy. But most of all, he wanted to be on the right side of God. And to his death, he refused to compromise what he knew to be right and true. The sad thing is that too many Americans today are living by lies. We are witnessing this all around us. Our leaders try to tell us that men can be women, and vice versa, that trans women can use girls' bathrooms and dressing rooms and compete with biological girls physically and not cause trauma, injustice, injury, and sexual abuse. That drag queen story hour for our young won't sow emotional and sexual distress and confusion, ending in dangerous medical procedures, emotional trauma, and the inevitable destroyed lives, not to mention the moral degradation that is central to such beliefs and practices. They tell us that open borders won't lead to loss of American jobs, sovereignty, and security, and that it won't encourage human trafficking, crime, and cartel-driven drug epidemics, and the sexual exploitation of women and children. That refusing to prosecute criminals based solely upon their race or ethnic background won't end up costing countless innocent lives, rotting and dividing our nation from within, and making our cities unlivable. Though different to some degree, these are the types of assaults on truth that Algernon Sydney gave his life to oppose. Sydney is best known for his work titled Discourses Concerning Government. Published a decade after his death in 1698, the primary message of Sydney's discourses hinges on the concept that legitimate leadership always derives its just power from the consent of the governed. You probably recognize those words. Lacking justice and equality, the people always retain the right to rebel against such tyranny and institute new government, righteously expelling the old with impunity. These are natural rights of man. They come from God, not government, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. Though fashioned by Jefferson many years later, the following is from the heart, mind, and soul of Algernon Sydney. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Unquote. Thomas Jefferson channeled Algernon Sydney. So did John Adams and, of course, Abigail Adams. Sydney's teachings also permeate the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He declared that no government or leader is legitimate before God, who builds his power on the backs of its suffering citizens. So, after a rigged trial, our hero died. Still, mercifully, his God-inspired ideas survived. His legacy continues to shape the destiny of nations. Stand with me in Independence Hall in Philadelphia and listen. In reverential silence, if you can, you will hear the whisperings of the ages, where the foundations of freedom were raised high and laid block by truth-inspired block. Joan of Arc, Sir Thomas More, Thomas Jefferson, John and Abigail Adams, Ben Franklin, and George Washington. There in this hallowed hall, Algernon Sydney's spirit lives on. I felt that spirit while standing alone at the entry to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., peering reverently inside, or atop the sacred floating monument to the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. God-given liberty, the kind Sydney envisioned as the inheritance, the right of all mankind. The American Revolution, unique in its birth and global impact, needs to be respectfully remembered. How our heroes unselfishly, with their blood, cleared our path on the road to freedom and prosperity. Algernon Sydney, as forgotten a hero as I have known, still has much to offer those with eyes to see and ears to hear. Long live our blessed, hard-fought victory, personal liberty over elitist-controlled collectivist tyranny. We thank you, Algernon Sydney, for gifting us God-given, inspired life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you for your time. I'm Grandpa Rick.